Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis of how it impacts your work. Plus, we are talking about the state and the federal budget, what you need to know as we head into January, plus the predictions from two of our experts in the field.
The ACSA legislative lunch break starts now.
And it's a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA legislative lunch break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazwata, ACSA's executive director. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA's senior director of marketing and communications. Welcome. We are honored to have you with us today. Thank you for your patience as we got everything lined up from the tech side. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello and let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
We got a little 2 minutes late. Hopefully we were worth the wait here, right? We don't like to keep people waiting, but I know we're navigating some of the behind the scenes stuff. But I'm glad we got going.
Yes,
last show of the year, right?
Last show of the year.
I know last week I said I stressed out, thinking that last week that I had missed. Now it would have been so much. I'm glad I was wrong. It was not last week. So much content that
right there
had not been available to us last week.
But now, of course, it's available. Now, of course, it's available because you're sporting your Dodger blue on this final show, our holiday show here of the ACSA legislative lunch break. For those of you who don't know, Edgar's Dodgers signed this outfielder to a ridiculously large contract, and because of that, Edgar wanted to make sure he was sporting his Dodger gear to be able to talk about that. I assume, Edgar, you're getting a little bit of a kickback here with the $700 million contract.
Yeah, $700 million. I know people are calling him cheaters. Those that didn't see some of the money deferred. By the way, I will never ask for that type of contract at ACSA, whether it be the dollar amount or the deferred amount. Like that's I heard from a legislator yesterday, not to be named, but they're sour grapes because they're a Giants fan. They said that they were going to pass a bill in the California legislature to prevent that from happening again. So I love it. I love having Giants fans being mad. I love everybody else being mad. Yes, I had to throw out the Dodger holiday sweater. So good. I'm a happy fan here. Even if Dodger dogs might cost me $35 next year, but it'll be worth it there to watch a Shohei Ohtani there.
As a Giants fan and season ticket holder, I only have one question for you. Why would you spend $700 million over the next 10 years for one player when you're going to go out in the first round of the playoffs?
I knew that was coming. We'll wait and see on that. The good thing, you have 10 years of that to look forward to. So let's see how that goes.
We'll wait and see how that goes. Lester Powell was first on the chat today. He beat Neri, but Neri's with us today. Ellen Wheeler, Mark Campbell, Grant Bennett with us as well. William Redford, again, Donna Campbell, Jeff Oaks. So happy that you guys were patient with us as we got things lined up.
Circus outfit. Neri said you're wearing a circus outfit.
Hey, come on. I'm celebrating my Bears here. We got to win this week. I mean, come on. We got to win this week. We should all be, sporting Bear stuff if we have a little pride today, us Bears fans. Hey, want to let you know, we've got two budget experts coming on the show a little bit later to talk about the state budget and the federal budget. Last week, we talked a little bit about the LAO and their look at the budget outlook over the next 3 years. We were talking about $68 billion deficit over a 3-year period. Edgar, you had the chance twice last week. You were quoted in EdSource. You were also on KQED radio talking about the budget. What's the basic message and tenor that you're hearing out there from not just from our members, but other education leaders from other organizations?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, and this is a sign of times, that it's they never want our quote when things are really good. It feels
Right.
like it's always they're looking for us to say something when things are looking negative. So, as I know Patty's going to speak to this on the state side, but I think as everybody saw the headlines, the legislative analysts came out with their report with some of their initial projections of what revenue is at for the state, and they're not good. I don't know how else to put it. They're not good. Now, what we will say is it's a first step in the process. We have to wait till January to see the governor's budget, all the things, again, not to steal Patty's thunder. We luckily we're in a better situation in terms of these rainy day funds than the state was the last time we were in a shortfall. But that the sentiment, I think, is really just nervousness, right? In terms of what is this going to do? How is this thing going to impact funding to schools? What is that going to do in terms of some of the momentum that we've built up over the last number of years in terms of some of these huge investments, some of these huge commitments that we've made to a lot of programs? So I think it's fair to say now, because of just the landscape of our educational leaders, none of them are immune to this. Almost every one of our leaders, even if they weren't in the superintendency or principal, wherever, they've been in the system long enough to have seen these ebbs and flows. So it's not like it's news to us. But it's not the conversation we're ever looking to have there in November. We much more like it when those projections are looking rosy. That's not the case this year. Now, what comes next, I think, is the fair question that everybody is having.
Yeah. And again, two experts in the field coming up in just a moment to talk about the state budget and what's happening with the federal budget. Want to direct your attention to a really interesting story. We talk so much about the educator shortage here, Edgar, especially in subject matter like math and science and special education. We actually have some good news to report today. A 4-year California program designed to help school districts recruit, train, and retain special education teachers has been a success, according to the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. Now, in 2018 and 19, the Budget Act, the state authorized $50 million for competitive grants to help school districts find solutions to address the shortage. 41 LEAs were funded within this $50 million to implement provisions of this program. That allowed the LEAs the opportunity and flexibility to implement local solutions to meet those needs. More than $45 million of the $50 million has been spent: tuition, stipends, induction, and to reduce student debt. This number, I think, is an interesting data point, Edgar. I'll have you reflect on it. The CTC reporting to the state legislature, data shows 82% of the teacher candidates participating in that program, nearly 4,000 teachers have been hired or are on track to be hired as special education teachers. So, Edgar, again, we've talked about the educator shortage. Special ed, certainly one of those places where we have seen a very big shortage. To see a state program working to get these types of teachers into the industry, this is a big deal.
Yeah, and it is a big deal. I know it doesn't, I think the overall narrative is obviously we have a need. We need to continue to fill that need. But I think it's always good to take some solace on some of these very poignant and strategic programs to get at the specific areas of need. And we always, like you said it, special ed, math, science, those are the places that we hear from our folks. We see in the data that there's always the most acute shortages. I think in this case, the state has come up with a strategy to at least fill some of that. So yeah, I think this is, it also gives us some best practices on some of the components that need to be in place to really bringing in continued educators into the fold there.
Yeah. Let me just make note of one more thing. You've asked, and we've listened. Coming in January, we're making the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break available to you as a podcast. So you'll be able to listen to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break while on the go. You'll be able to find our podcast, again, beginning with the first show we do in January on Spotify and Apple Music. We'll tell you a little bit more about that as we move into January, but certainly very exciting. We've had a number of members, Edgar, who've asked us, hey, can you guys do a podcast? Okay, we're going to do a podcast. Now you've asked for it, so now you got to listen.
They're just probably tired of me saying, hey, I was at so-and-so event and a member asked, can we put this on the podcast, right? Maybe it was just a reason they wanted a podcast. They don't want to see your ugly jackets anymore, Naj. Yeah. So maybe that is the reason to do an audio podcast. But I am excited that we are going and we're venturing out. I'm a big podcast fan. So I think giving our members different ways to not only digest this show, but I know we're also thinking about other different ways, information that we could put out to our members through different types of modalities. So excited for that news here coming January.
Absolutely. By the way, I just want to tell you, if I'm going to showcase my favorite viewer for today, it's Dr. Mina Blasi, who just has put on there
defending you in the jacket.
She needs the jacket. I mean, frankly, she's my favorite today. So thank you, Mina, for that very much. Let's go ahead and let's shift to our topic today. Federal budget, state budget, a lot of news out there. We wanted to bring experts in the field on today's show to answer some of your questions. Steve Wojtek is policy advisor, Foresight Law and Policy, our federal advocacy arm, and Patty Herrera, Vice President of School Services of California, who's closing in on 5-time guest status here, Edgar, on the show. I believe she's at 4, which means that the next time she gets ACSA business cards. So be ready to present those. Steve and Patty, so good to have you here on the show. Patty, let's start. Let's walk us through what has happened here. We expected there to be a deficit, but I don't think we expected it to be such a big deficit, $68 billion over 3 years. It was unexpected. Why did we get here?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me. And I feel a little out of the my element here because I didn't get the memo about the, get up. And so I had to quickly position my Steelers paraphernalia in my office to make sure that my Steelers got a shout out today. So we're rebuilding, just so you know, my team's rebuilding. So to answer your question, Naj, I mean, I think, well, here at School Services, we track state revenues pretty closely, and we also track larger economic trends. What we really look for in terms of what's going to impact state revenues in California is we look at how the stock market is performing. And it, was no surprise to us that the stock market was underperforming, throughout 2022. So we anticipated that 2022 tax collections were going to fall short of state budget estimates. And we did. You don't ever want to be one of those annoying people that says we told you so, but we did highlight last year at the ACSA conference, and then again in our budget workshops, that we really believe that the governor's revenue estimates were pretty aggressive, and especially and that ultimately the budget that the state adopted presented the riskiest budget in a decade, because our state lawmakers were making a decision with a huge blindfold on, which was not having those traditional April tax receipts as part of their information portfolio to build a budget on. So really the biggest driver of that $68 billion deficit that the state is facing for the 24-25 fiscal year is the fact that 22 tax collections underperformed estimates by $26 billion. Mm-hmm. And as the LAO highlighted, that's on top of a deficit that the legislature and the governor built in to the budget moving into 24-25 of $14 billion. Mm. So those are the biggest drivers, I think, for why some folks were not anticipating such a big hole. And then I really just have to acknowledge that if the legislature, depending on how the legislature and the governor confront the deficit that we're facing, which is $68 billion, the LAO warns that we could be looking at, a deficit that balloons to $155 billion in 2027. Mm. So I think what I'd like to kind of emphasize here is that, revenues underperformed in 2022. We have a softening economy, but it's still a growing economy. We're not in a recession. And so I think really how California deals with this is going to be a legislative and budget decision. right? And so whether or not we deal with it well or we deal with it poorly is a matter of fiscal policy, not necessarily how the economy is performing. And so I do think that our lawmakers have some difficult decisions to make ahead of them.
Steve, you heard what Patty said. It's kind of, I'm nervous anytime we have to look to Washington, D.C. to potentially give us a better or different news. But with that said, I mean, we pay so much attention on Sacramento, but a lot of our funding and just the overall policy landscape obviously is dictated by D.C. So not just whether it be reaction to what the landscape here is in California, or just give us a flavor for what's happening in DC. I know it's interesting times for maybe a different set of circumstances. What's the latest from our nation's capital?
Sure. And thank you also for letting us join you all today. I apologize. I am not decked out in any NFL gear either. We're a Ravens household here, and purple is just not my color. So I apologize for not coming in more festive wear. But to the question, unlike state budgets, for better or for worse, the federal government can operate on a deficit and has for some time. Right now, as you've probably seen in the headlines over the past few months and over the past year, frankly, there's been a lot of dysfunction in Congress, particularly regarding the current federal budget and appropriations process. So as a reminder, that process is already 3 months behind schedule, and probably a lot more depending on where you kind of look at when things should have been done. We're currently in the federal fiscal year 2024 cycle, which technically began on October 1st of this year. So since that time, as you probably have gathered, we've been operating federal funding on a series of short-term extensions of funding known as continuing resolutions, or CRs. So for most of the calendar year, the key kind of issue or area of disagreement has been around the top line figures for the entire federal budget, which is the first and kind of most important step in the wider budget and appropriations process. Because until we have agreement on what the size of the federal budget looks like in any given year, we can't negotiate and determine all of the sub-allocations for the 12 individual spending bills, including the Labor H bill, which provides education funding for K-12 education, workforce development, all of the other kinds of programs that we care about until that's kind of hashed out. If you recall, earlier this year, back in May, there was a agreement Congress made around the debt ceiling or the debt limit, which established two top line kind of frameworks for this current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. And what's really been the rub is that House Republicans have largely spent most of the calendar year advancing legislation that falls well below the established top lines in what's called the Fiscal Responsibility Act, or the FRA, which is that debt limit agreement that was signed into law all the way back in May of this year. Just as a reminder, and to kind of put a finer point on what those proposed cuts from House Republicans would do, this would cut the Every Student Succeeds Act, so Title I funding for ESSA, by 80%, nearly $15 billion. And this was passed out of committee over the summer. It was briefly negotiated and considered by the full House of Representatives earlier this fall. Thankfully, those negotiations fell through, and the legislation has not been taken up since. To put this in the context of California, though, those cuts would equate to about $1.7 billion in less federal funding from Title I of ESSA if enacted as currently structured and proposed, again, in the House Labor H bill. We've calculated, along with some of the ranking members on the committee in the House, that would equate to about 25 to 26,000 teacher positions in California alone. So again, pretty drastic cuts that are being proposed there. But to be clear, this process requires buy-in from the Senate. And right now, the Senate's proposals to date on federal spending on these same issues have been far more reasonable and bipartisan, which is really, I think, an important feature that we're trying to get Congress to kind of move forward with as they continue to negotiate. But until that top line spending figure is kind of determined and hashed out by the leaders in Congress and the White House, we're kind of at a stalemate right now. So that's, I think, kind of the latest on what's been going on in Congress, which is a lot, but not quite anything over the finish line just yet.
Yeah, I mean, those are a couple of big data points that you mentioned there, Steve. 80%, and then 1.7 billion in federal Title I funding could be cut. If you have a question for Steve or Patty, go ahead and put those into the chat. We'll try and tackle some of those at the end. Patty, the LAO proposed some different initial ideas on how to confront some of this budget challenge, some of this deficit challenge. But I think it would be prudent to ask, when you look at that 68 billion over 3 years, or another scary data point of, possibly getting to 155 by 2027, how does this impact schools?
So it can impact schools really significantly, because right now education funding in California is computed really as a ratio or as a percentage of every state dollar. It's around 40 cents of every state dollar goes to education. So during prosperous times, if we have an unanticipated dollar come into the state coffers, that means 40 cents goes to schools. Well, conversely, when revenues are underperforming against projections, that means that education will be affected commensurately by a drop of 40 cents for every dollar that we thought would come into state coffers. So, for example, the LAO estimates that from the underperforming 2022 tax collections, Proposition 98 was affected by about $9 billion in the 2022-23 fiscal year. So basically the minimum guarantee, the constitutional obligation for the state to spend on K-12 and community colleges dropped by $9 billion. I think what you're asking though, Naj, is, okay, if that's the case, then what has the LAO offered their constituents, who are the legislators that the governor is going to have to negotiate this budget with? What are they offering to them as a solution to this? And by the way, the LAO, they're geniuses. And I got to tell you, Edgar Cabral, who oversees the K-12 education unit, just so you know about what a genius he is, he too is a Steelers fan. So next time I'm gonna have to vet my colleagues who are going to be co-presenting with me, because if I had known a Ravens fan was going to be in the room, I might have. So the LAO is offering a few solutions to the state, and I got to say, interestingly, all of their solutions to to the state budget in total, as well as to education, offers some solutions that could allow the state to continue to basically fund programs as they currently exist. The biggest tool that the state has, according to the LAO, of course, are all of the rainy day funds that we've been depositing money into, including the state's rainy day fund. They believe that the state is going to have the ability to use $24 billion in the state's rainy day fund to address the shortfall in the 24-25 budget, but as you noted, Naj, across the 3-year budget window. And then specifically for education, they're also offering a similar solution. You all know that we have a Proposition 98 or Education Rainy Day Fund, and we're going to have to make some adjustments to really the balance of that account because of the lower revenues. Our requirements to deposit funds into that account are reduced, and so they think that we've got about almost $9 billion in the fund that the state could tap into. So if the state were to do that, tap into both of those funds to address deficits on both the education side of the budget and the non-education side of the budget, they do believe that along with some savings, they just call workload savings, that the state could address the budget problem. So the question is whether or not our governor and our legislature are willing to recognize the budget emergency that we're facing and use those tools in their toolbox.
Patty, I'll ask you, I'll throw this follow-up question that I know we got from Ellen, and I think it's something you said earlier, but I'll ask the question nonetheless. I guess the Fed made an announcement this morning that they think that interest rates may be cut 3 times and multiple times next year. I think you responded, and I think it's an interesting point for us Californians, that because I know school services does some of this economic forecasting, but you see that there's not necessarily a direct correlation, right, in terms of how the economy may respond to what our budget shortfall. Do you want to reiterate that or say anything else in response to Ellen's question?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just say actually that the news that we've been tracking the inflation really, really closely over the last couple of years. And just, I mean, we look at CPI, the consumer price index, but the index that the Federal Reserve relies on is the consumer spending index, and but very closely related. So the fact that the Federal Reserve signaled, and I think the market was looking for this signal, that it's going to start easing off of the monetary tightening policies over the last couple of years, I actually think is going to buoy the stock market. And for California, that's a really, really good thing because of our progressive tax system in California. 50% of personal income tax revenues are generated by 1% of Californians in the state, and so those are our richest residents here, and so they earn their dollars or their income through investments in the stock market. And so if in fact I would imagine that the market is responding positively to today's signal by the Federal Reserve, and so we would hope to see continual improvement in the stock market, which would be a really good thing for general fund revenues and 98.
Thanks, Patty. Steve, switching gears a little bit. I know in your first question, you talked obviously about the landscape in DC, the differences. I mean, for all of our issues, at least we don't have to deal with the government shutdown on the state level, right? That's more of an issue on the feds. And we've seen the back and forth. We've seen kind of the CRs, the deals that have been cut. If ultimately we do get to a point of having a shutdown because they can't find another agreement, what would the anticipated impact be to education on that?
Great question. And just as a reminder, the current CR, that short-term extension of federal funding right now, as it relates to education funding, so a lot of the formula dollars that go out to states like California for educational purposes, that all expires on February 2nd of next year. So that's the new kind of deadline that is kind of pushing Congress forward in these negotiations. In terms of practical effects, I mean, obviously federal funding is supplemental to the state and local funding that supports education. But given the way that funding has kind of been sporadically kind of determined through Congress over the past year, it's very hard, as I'm sure your members can appreciate, to make long-term plans about what to do with that supplemental funding in the future. So that's a big point that we make to lawmakers here in DC, is this really inhibits any ability to make strategic and long-term plans regarding education efforts at K-12, at the K-12 level. Looking further afield, right now, nobody is trying to say that a shutdown is imminent, but obviously that is a possibility. That continued disagreement around the top line is going to be a key issue that's going to come front and center in front of Congress next year. And so that's going to be the key thing that we're kind of watching in Congress, whether they can resolve that, whether they fall back on a longer term extension of funding, which has also been met with some resistance with appropriations leaders here on the Hill as well. So don't have a crystal ball on what's going to happen necessarily, but those are the large contours of what's going to immediately be in front of Congress and that they need to address next month when they return in early January.
We'll see. Now, Steve, I'm going to make you bring out your crystal ball, because I was going to ask both of you as we close out here, from your perspective, Patty here in California, and then Steve on the federal government. One thing our members should have on their radar in 2024, and one prediction that you have for 2024? Patty, I'll start with you.
I feel like there's so many things that people should have on top of mind in 2024. I think probably the most important one to me right now is that districts are building their budgets for 2024 and across the multi-year window, right? Because of our obligation to do multi-year budgets, considering that the cost of living adjustment is not going to be at the levels of 6%, 8%, 13% that we've enjoyed over the last few years. We've been reporting out, and I'm sure Edgar has been and your GR team has been talking incessantly about the LAO's most recent COLA estimate, now measured at 1.27%. That's more aligned with historical trends for cost of living adjustment. And I get really nervous about districts overcommitting if these resources don't continue to show up at their doorstep at these rates. And so I would say that I think one thing that they've got to keep top of mind is that these high cost of living adjustments that we've been enjoying over the last 4 or 5 years, they're not going to be sustained. And so we'll get a taste of that in January when the governor releases his budget and the Department of Finance shares their out-year projections. But we can nobody was expecting a 1% COLA for 2024. In fact, the Department of Finance in June predicted the COLA would be measuring about 4%. So that's a significant adjustment that districts are having to make as they prepare to adopt budgets in June. So that's one thing. My prediction for 2024 is I really think for Proposition 98, I really think that the LAO provided the legislature and the governor a really elegant pathway to help address the needs of the state and the needs of school districts, which is to utilize the rainy day fund to keep districts and students and teachers and staff whole at the local level, while also not over obligating the state of California to a spending obligation that the state may not be able to afford in the out years. And you have to kind of read that kind of in between the lines in the LAO's forecast. But it really presents a really elegant solution. And I think my prediction is that that's where the governor and the legislature are going to land.
And Steve, one thing our members should have on their radar in 2024 and one prediction.
Sure. So I think first, one thing to have on the radar is some of the workforce legislation that's working its way through Congress right now. Just this week, the House, which has been very polarized and divided on a number of issues, including appropriations, as I've been talking about today, just passed 44-1 on the Education Committee, a reauthorization proposal for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA. Obviously, that youth funding that is contained in Title I of that law has implications for K-12 districts throughout the state of California. And in particular, some of the other work that's been recently announced earlier this year by the governor regarding a master plan in the state for career education. So I think there's some interesting connection points there as that legislation continues to work its way through the federal legislative process that should definitely be on folks' radars going into next year. In terms of a prediction, I think on another note related to education data and research functions, there's been some really encouraging developments happening in the Senate on that regard, which I think will have some implications for statewide longitudinal data systems and that kind of space. So obviously big implications for California's cradle to career data system and things like that. That we're kind of monitoring very closely in Congress. So I would not be surprised to see new legislation on that topic, particularly on what's called the Education Sciences Reform Act, or ESRA, reemerge next year as another area of bipartisan consensus in 2024.
Mm-hmm. All right, Steve Wojtek, Policy Advisor, Foresight Law and Policy. Patty Herrera, Vice President, School Services of California. Steve and Patty, thank you so much for being with us here on the final edition of the lunch break for 2023. When we have you back here for the last episode of 2024, we will make sure you are aware of the requirement for holiday attire.
And since it'll be my 5th invitation, I want the Steelers jacket.
We'll make Edgar put that on your on the budget.
We'll see if we can make that happen.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much for being with us today.
Thanks,
Have a great
everybody.
one.
Appreciate it.
Folks, if you like what you have seen here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we invite you to subscribe to us on YouTube or like us on Facebook. You'll get instant updates when we're about to come on with breaking news, and a regular update when we're about to come on the air with our normal Wednesday show. So go ahead and subscribe and like us. If you have great stories happening in your school community, we want to tell your stories as well. Go ahead and send your photos, bullet points, news releases to our EdCal editor, Michelle Carl at mcarl@axa.org. Our Every Child Counts Symposium coming up in January down in Southern California. Here's a preview. Yes, for more information on our Every Child Counts Symposium, go to axa.org/professional-learning for information on that, our ACSA Superintendent Symposium, all of our professional learning opportunities. Edgar, it has been an incredible 2020. Are you eating?
Gummy bear? And I thought that promo was going to last a couple seconds more than it did. I'm sorry. I almost.
That's all right. Because you know what? I don't know if you noticed it or our viewers noticed it, but we caught Steve drinking his water while on camera. So, I mean, that's fine, right?
It was water. It's the holidays. I wouldn't have judged them if it was something else either. But.
That is true. Folks, don't forget January, our ACSA Legislative Lunch Break podcast debuts. Likely, this is our last show until January 10th, which I believe, Edgar, will be budget week here in the state of California, the budget proposal. So we'll be looking forward to that. Folks, thank you so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, not just today, but for all of 2023. Happy holidays to you. We'll see you in 2024. Have a great rest of the day, rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.